Hi, my name is Richard Green. I'm a professor at the University of Southern California, and I will be speaking on Friday about whether housing is an intractable problem for countries developed and less developed around the world. One of the things about India is it's difficult to build here. There's clearly a lot of demand for housing, but it's not easy to supply it. And particularly in the places where it's most demanded, like Mumbai, it is most difficult to supply. And a lot of that is because of zoning. FSIs are very low. Strangely enough, Mumbai is the densest city in India. In fact, it's one of the 2 or 3 densest cities in the world. And yet it has free FSI of about 1.3, and you can pay for FSI of up to 2.8. And if you look at cities of similar size, their typically free FSI is about 8. So one of the things India should be thinking about is just how do you make it easier to build housing? Now, the problem with greater density, of course, is it means you need infrastructure to support the density, but there are a couple of things there too. First of all, the density already isn't here in Indian cities. People are there, they're just not living inside houses. They're living on the street, or they're living in slums where you see the phenomenon of multi-story slum buildings. So the idea that, well, we don't have the infrastructure so we can't have the people is sort of beside the point, because there's already the people. But the second thing is, if you change zoning and you didn't just increase density, but you made developers pay for the density and with cash, maybe bid for the density, you could drive the resources necessary to put in the sewer, the water, the electricity, and the transport system necessary in order to make this kind of density comfortable for people to live in. Beyond all that, however, is even if India were to solve its supply problem, that still won't be enough, because you can't build housing cheaply enough for those who are at the lower end of the income spectrum in India. And that's why it's also important to think about subsidy. And the issue is, how do you do subsidy the right kind of way? And there are countries around the world, like South Africa and Brazil, that have spent a lot of money on housing subsidies, and yet not very effectively. And so we need to look at examples of places, and people get tired of hearing about Singapore, but nevertheless, in Singapore they came up when it was still a very poor place with a mechanism to subsidize low-income people in a more efficient manner than we see in many other countries. The first thing is, I think in general, in-kind transfers are better than having governments build, maintain, and manage housing. Governments just don't do a very good job of it. You see a lot of leakage when you have these sort of programs. But the more important thing is, when the housing that people can afford is located in specific locations, it may not be very appealing. And so we see in Brazil and we see in South Africa, for example, lots of housing, subsidized housing provided for people, but long distances from jobs. And so the housing is built, it's given to people take the housing, and then they either rent it out at a substantial discount or sell it at a substantial discount, and then move back into a favela or a slum that is conveniently located. So I think that's a lesson that India does not want to follow. It shouldn't do that kind of thing. Whereas if you look at places that use in-kind transfer, so you basically give people money that allows them to compete in the housing market, you wind up with better outcomes. And in particular in the United States, there's been a program called Moving to Opportunity. And what you see is, when parents can move their kids to neighborhoods with better schools and safer communities and so on, those kids do better. Now, you got to move those kids at a sufficiently young age that it matters. And it takes a while to actually see these better outcomes. But giving people the ability to live where they want to live, understanding that you got to give them some money in order for that to happen, I think is a much more effective way to do subsidy programs than to try to have the government decide where people should live and to manage where those people live.